What right did she have, a ghost from the economy cabin, to believe she could command the sky? The sneering thought echoed in the minds of many as the woman stood up, a solitary point of stillness in a cabin convulsing with panic. Moments after the captain collapsed, she dared to move toward the cockpit, her presence an affront to the established order of things. Passengers, their fear curdling into derision, saw not a savior but a fraud, a nobody chasing a dangerous, delusional heroism. But she did not retreat. She simply advanced, carrying a name once whispered in reverence, a name the world believed had been buried by the sands of time 7 years ago. Flight 716 was a microcosm of the world, suspended 7 miles above the earth, a gleaming aluminum tube arcing through the deep, indifferent blue of the stratosphere. It carried within its pressurized hull all the vanities, fears, and hierarchies of the society below. In first class, the illusion of control was paramount. The air was cool and filtered, smelling of expensive leather, hot towels, and the crisp effervescence of champagne. Here, Lorraine, a corporate lawyer whose ambition was as sharp and unforgiving as her stilettos, was highlighting clauses on a contract displayed on her tablet. The faint turbulence was an annoyance, a minor imperfection in her meticulously ordered universe. She sighed, took a sip of her Pinot Grigio, and made a mental note to draft a complaint about the subpar Wi-Fi. Across the aisle, Preston, a hedge fund manager accustomed to the bespoke silence of his Gulfstream, simmered with resentment. A last-minute mechanical issue had forced him onto this commercial flight, an indignity he felt on a cellular level. He had already sent back his wine twice, declaring it barely drinkable, and now scowled at the flight attendant who offered him a warm nut mix. "Is this the best you can do?" He'd sneered, dismissing her with a wave of his hand. He radiated an aura of impatient entitlement, as if the very air he breathed was a commodity he had overpaid for and found wanting. Nearby, the heiress Genevieve was idly scrolling through social media, her diamond rings catching the light as she judged the fashion choices of her rivals with silent, venomous contempt. Further back, beyond the thick curtain that served as a flimsy border between worlds, the economy cabin was a different ecosystem. It was a hum of lived-in humanity. A baby cried softly, a student from Berlin snored with his head against the window, and a young couple held hands, their faces illuminated by the glow of a shared screen. In a window seat in row 32, Alara Vance watched the vast expanse of clouds, a rolling, featureless sea of white. To anyone who glanced her way, she was a figure of profound unremarkableness. Her khaki jacket was worn at the elbows in cuffs, a testament to years of practical use rather than fashion. Her jeans were faded, her boots sturdy and scuffed. Her brown hair, threaded with the first hints of silver, was tied back in a simple, functional knot. She had spent 7 years meticulously cultivating this anonymity. After a life lived at the sharp edge of the spear, she had moved through the world like a whisper, finding a quiet, unexpected peace in being overlooked, in being just another face in the crowd. She observed the subtle dynamics of the cabin with an old ingrained habit of situational awareness. She noted the nervous flyer in row 31, his knuckles white on the armrest. She noted the quiet competence of the senior flight attendant, Susan, who moved through the aisle with an air of unshakable calm. She noted the subtle change in the engine's pitch, a fractional shift in vibration that no one else seemed to perceive. 2 hours after a smooth departure from Paris, that peace and the fragile order of Flight 716 shattered. It began not with a bang, but with a sickening, gut-wrenching lurch. The plane dropped, not like turbulence, but like a stone. A collective gasp was stolen from 200 throats at once, replaced by a wave of shrieks that pierced the cabin's calm. Trays clattered to the floor, laptops slid from tables, and the cheerful hum of the engines was suddenly overshadowed by a series of frantic, high-pitched electronic alarms blaring from the front of the aircraft. Panic, ugly and primal, erupted like a contagion. People grabbed for their armrests, for their loved ones, for anything solid in a world that had suddenly lost its foundation. The plane shuddered violently, a groan of stressed metal echoing through its frame. Audra, a young flight attendant on only her 6th transatlantic crossing, felt her training evaporate in a cold wave of terror. Her face was a mask of practiced calm, but her heart hammered against her ribs. She rushed to the front, her movements clumsy in the tilting aisle. She pounded on the thick, reinforced cockpit door, Captain Sterling, co-pilot, please respond. Is everything all right in there? The only answer was the continued, terrifying silence from within and the cacophony of alarms that bled through the door. It was then, amidst the screaming and the crying and the desperate prayers, that Alara Vance moved. She didn't rush. Her movements were unnervingly deliberate. She took her unassuming glasses, folded them with a steady hand, and tucked them securely into the inner pocket of her jacket. She unbuckled her seatbelt with a soft click that was utterly lost in the din. Then she stood. As she walked down the aisle, her worn boots finding purchase on the tilting floor, she was an island of preternatural calm in a sea of hysteria. Her gaze was not panicked. It was analytical, sharp, and focused entirely on the locked cockpit door. This was a problem, and she was a problem solver. When Alara reached the front of the cabin, the chaos was at its peak. Audra was still banging on the door, her pleas growing more frantic. Alara placed a light but firm hand on the young woman's shoulder. Audra spun around, her eyes wide and tear-filled. "Ma'am, please, you have to return to your seat. It's an emergency." "I know," Alara said. Her voice was quiet, yet it possessed a strange resonance that cut through the noise. "Open the door. I can fly the plane." The statement was so simple, so direct. It seemed to hang in the air for a fraction of a second, a bubble of impossible audacity. Then the bubble burst, and the first wave of ridicule hit. It came, predictably, from the first-class cabin, where fear was rapidly being replaced by indignation. Lorraine looked up from her tablet, which she was clutching to her chest like a shield. She let out a short, sharp laugh of disbelief. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice dripping with the condescension she usually reserved for incompetent junior associates. "Who in God's name do you think you are? Did you watch a film on the flight and get ideas? This isn't Hollywood, sweetheart." Preston, his face flushed with a mixture of terror and rage, unbuckled his seatbelt and stood, steadying himself on the seat in front of him. "Is this a joke? We're in a life-or-death situation, and this budget traveler thinks she can play pilot?" He jabbed a finger, adorned with a heavy gold ring, in Alara's direction. "Get her away from that door before she gets us all killed." "Security," he bellowed, as if expecting a private security detail to materialize. His outburst was a signal. It gave permission to the other passengers to channel their helpless fear into a more manageable emotion: scorn. Garrison, the self-made entrepreneur whose entire identity was built on the belief that he was the most competent person in any room, strode forward. "Listen, lady," he boomed, his voice accustomed to commanding boardrooms. "This isn't some community theater production where you get to live out a fantasy. There are lives at stake, lives of important people. We don't have time for your delusions." A few passengers behind him snickered nervously, a cruel, sharp sound that seemed to solidify the cabin's judgment. Alara did not flinch. She did not raise her voice, did not offer a defense, did not even acknowledge their existence. Her entire focus remained on Audra's panicked eyes, her own gaze unwavering and clear. This silence was not weakness. It was a heavy, weighted thing, a shield forged in the fires of crises these passengers could never comprehend. Her stillness seemed to infuriate them even more. "What's the matter? No comeback?" Lorraine taunted, leaning forward in her seat, a predatory glint in her eyes. "Figures. People like you, all talk and no substance. You crumble under the slightest pressure." In the back of the plane, Doris, the single mother, hugged her son's photograph to her chest. She saw the quiet woman's calm, the utter lack of panic in her posture, and a flicker of hope ignited within her. "Why are they being so horrible?" she whispered to the man next to her, who just shook his head and closed his eyes to pray. "She's just trying to help." Her small voice of reason was instantly swallowed by the rising tide of contempt. The passengers had formed a jury. They had examined the evidence: a faded jacket, worn-out jeans, a face unadorned with makeup, a quiet demeanor, and they had delivered their swift, unanimous verdict: guilty of being a nobody, and therefore guilty of being a threat. The plane dropped again, a violent, stomach-churning plummet that tore a fresh wave of screams from the passengers. The attack on Alara was silenced for a moment, replaced by the more immediate terror of falling. Audra, her face ashen, braced herself against the bulkhead. She put a trembling hand up to block Alara. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, I can't. It's against every FAA regulation. I could lose my job, we could all be arrested. Only certified, active pilots can enter that cockpit." "I am a certified pilot," Alara stated again, her patience, a finite resource, wearing thin. Every second they wasted arguing was a few hundred feet of altitude lost. Time was a luxury they no longer possessed. "I need proof, a license, an ID, something," Audra cried, her voice a desperate plea for order in a world dissolving into chaos. Without another word, Ilara reached into the simple, worn leather wallet she carried. She bypassed the few credit cards and the small bundle of cash and pulled out a small metallic card. It wasn't plastic. It was made of a heavy, brushed metal alloy. It was scuffed, and its edges were worn smooth from years of being carried, but the golden lettering and the embossed eagle of the United States Air Force were unmistakable. The photo showed a younger woman, her hair cut short, her eyes blazing with a fierce confidence, a stark contrast to the quiet, unassuming woman who now held it. She held it out to Audra. Audra took it with a shaking hand. Her eyes scanned the text, and her breath hitched. The name etched into the metal was clear: Captain Alara Vance. The name meant nothing to most, just another name in a world full of them. But not to everyone. In the business class section, Kalen, the young tech developer, had abandoned the news feeds and was now trying to find information on emergency flight procedures, a futile attempt to feel some sense of control. He overheard the name, and it snagged on a thread of memory. "Alara Vance," he muttered, his fingers flying across the screen of his phone. "Why do I know that name?" He typed it into a search engine. A moment later, he gasped, a sharp, audible intake of breath. He shot to his feet, holding his phone aloft like a priest presenting a holy relic. On the screen was a grainy news article from a military journal, dated 7 years prior. The article featured the same confident, smiling woman from the ID card, standing proudly before a sleek, deadly-looking F-22 Raptor. The headline was stark: "Decorated ace pilot Alara Vance missing, presumed dead after classified mission over hostile territory." A ripple of stunned silence spread through the cabin, a wave more powerful than the turbulence. The jeers died in their throats. Passengers stared, their eyes flicking from the phone screen to the quiet woman in the khaki jacket, trying to reconcile the two images. It was the same face, yes, but older now, etched with fine lines of hardship and grief that the photograph lacked. But the eyes were the same, unflinching, intense. The shock quickly curdled into a new, more insidious form of suspicion. The narrative of the delusional, nobody was shattered, but in its place, a more sinister one began to form. "Missing? For 7 years?" A man in a tweed jacket whispered. "Where in the world has she been?" Genevieve, the heiress, was the first to voice the new consensus. She let out a disbelieving snort. "So what if it's her? She's been missing for 7 years. That's a nice way of saying she's a deserter or a ghost. She's probably lost her nerve. Or worse, she's mentally unstable." Preston seized on this new angle with fervent relief. "Or a spy, a traitor," he declared, his voice rising with paranoid conviction. "Think about it. A decorated pilot disappears off the face of the earth for 7 years, and just happens to show up on this specific flight when the captain collapses? This is a setup. She's here to hijack the plane." The fear, once again needing a story to cling to, began to twist the miracle into a threat. But for Audra, standing at the epicenter of the decision, it was different. She looked from the ID card to the steady, unwavering command in Alara's eyes, and then at the flashing warning lights visible under the cockpit door. Regulations were for a world that made sense. This world no longer did. The woman in front of her was not a threat. She was the only chance they had. With a final, decisive nod that was an act of pure faith, she turned to the keypad next to the cockpit door. Her fingers flew, punching in the 7-digit emergency override code. The heavy door lock disengaged with a solid, definitive thud. Ilara stepped inside without a backward glance, the door swinging shut behind her, sealing her off from the world of doubt, accusation, and fear she left behind. The moment the cockpit door closed, the noise of the panicking cabin was replaced by a different kind of chaos, the controlled, electronic symphony of a dying machine. Red and yellow lights flashed across the vast control panel, a frantic Christmas tree of imminent failure. A synthesized female voice repeated, pull up, Terran," in a monotonous, terrifying loop. Captain Sterling was slumped in his seat, his face a ghastly shade of gray, his chest unmoving. The co-pilot, a young man named Ben, was white-knuckling the yoke, his movements jerky with panic as he fought a battle he was clearly losing. Ilara took it all in with a single, sweeping glance. This was her world. The noise, the danger, the razor-thin margin between life and death, it was as familiar and comforting to her as the silence of the library she now frequented. This was a language she understood. "I'll take it," she said, her voice a calm, solid presence in the storm. Ben looked up, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and profound relief. He nodded mutely, his hands falling away from the controls as if they were red hot. As Ilara slid into the captain's seat, the worn leather felt like a homecoming. Her hands moved over the complex array of buttons, switches, and dials with an intimacy that transcended conscious memory. It was instinct. It was muscle memory. It was belonging. She silenced the most jarring auditory alarms with a few deft flicks of her fingers, her mind instantly triaging the cascade of warnings. Engine 2 was running hot, hydraulic pressure was fluctuating, the autopilot was disengaged, and they were in a steep, uncontrolled descent, bleeding altitude at an alarming rate. A memory flashed, unbidden and sharp. The blistering 130-degree sun of a foreign desert seen from the cockpit of an F-22 Raptor, the dry crackle of urgent, coded voices in her helmet. "Sandpiper, you have a bogey on your 6. Brake right. Brake right." The mission had been a ghost operation, deep in territory where she officially did not exist. Something had gone wrong. A new, advanced surface-to-air missile system they hadn't known about. A sudden, blinding missile lock tone. The violent, wrenching spin as the explosion tore off her right wing. The terrifying, silent fall. The world had called her a hero, and, a month later, declared her dead. She had survived, ejecting into a desolate landscape, but the cost had been too high. 3 members of the Special Forces team she was supporting had been lost in the ensuing search. Their faces haunted her, so she had chosen to disappear, to let the world believe she was a ghost. She traded the sky she loved for the quiet anonymity of a normal life, a penance, a life where no one depended on her, where no one could be lost because of her. The pilot ID was the only piece of that life she had allowed herself to keep, a secret reminder of who she used to be. Now, that life had found her. Her hands closed around the yoke, her touch both gentle and firm, a surgeon's precision married to a warrior's resolve. She pulled back slowly, steadily, feeling the immense aerodynamic forces fighting her, the plane wanting to plunge toward the ocean. The groaning of the airframe intensified, a sound of metal screaming in protest, but she held firm. The steep angle of descent began to shallow. The terrifying pull-up alarm finally went silent. She keyed the radio, her thumb finding the button without looking. "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. This is Flight 716, an Airbus A330. We have an incapacitated captain and are off course, experiencing control difficulties. This is Captain Ilara Vance, assuming command." The voice that crackled back from a controller in Shannon, Ireland, was stunned into a moment of silence. "Flight 716, say again call sign of commanding pilot." "Confirmative," Ilara replied, her eyes never leaving the tumultuous horizon, her hands constantly making minute adjustments. "Call sign is Vance, Echo, Lima, Alpha, Romeo, Alpha. Explanations later. I need a clear corridor and priority landing at the nearest suitable airport. We have a medical emergency and potential systems failure. Now." There was another brief, charged pause. Then the controller's voice returned. All business, but with an undercurrent of awe. "Roger that. Flight 716. The sky is yours, Captain. Welcome back. Turn left heading 095. Descend and maintain flight level 100. Vectoring you for emergency approach to Shannon Airport." Her hands moved faster. Her mind, a supercomputer of calculations, wind speed, fuel consumption, approach vectors. She stabilized the aircraft's altitude, the violent shaking easing into a manageable rhythmic shudder. She then turned her attention to the intercom. Taking a deep breath, she pressed the button. Her voice, when it came, was the epitome of calm control, a cool stream of water on the fire of panic. "This is Captain Vance. To the passengers of Flight 716. We have stabilized the aircraft. We are diverting for an emergency landing in Ireland. Please remain seated and listen carefully to the instructions of the flight crew." For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the 200 souls in the cabin felt a fragile, blossoming seed of hope. They had a captain again. The descent was a controlled fall through a sky thick with malice. Rain, driven by gale-force winds, lashed against the cockpit windows, momentarily obscuring the world outside. The A-330 was a massive, wounded bird being battered by crosswinds, each gust sending a bone-jarring jolt through its frame. But through it all, there was a sense of purpose, of unwavering control, that hadn't been there before. The aircraft was no longer a victim of gravity. It was being guided by a master's hand. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere had undergone a profound and silent transformation. The open scorn and loud suspicion had evaporated, replaced by a tense, breathless, and deeply uncomfortable awe. Preston sat rigidly in his seat, his face pale and slick with sweat. He was staring blankly at the polished wood veneer of the seatback in front of him. His entire world, a carefully constructed edifice built on wealth, status, and the illusion of control, had been saved by a woman he had dismissed as budget trash. The cognitive dissonance was a physical weight in his chest. Lorraine's hands, which had been so steady and imperious on her tablet, were now clenched together in her lap, her knuckles white. Her professional mask of cool detachment had cracked, revealing the raw, primal fear beneath. But now, another emotion was seeping through the cracks, a hot, biting shame. She could still hear her own cruel, condescending words echoing in her mind. Genevieve had her eyes squeezed shut, her perfectly applied mascara running in thin, dark lines down her cheeks. She was whispering a desperate prayer, no longer for her own safety, but perhaps for forgiveness. They were all confronted with the undeniable, humbling truth. Their lives were entirely in the hands of the woman they had so viciously and publicly misjudged. The shame was a palpable thing, thick and suffocating as the cabin pressure dropped slightly. In the back, Willow, the quiet teenage girl, watched the cockpit door, not with fear, but with an expression of pure reverence. She had seen something in Alara from the beginning, a quiet, unshakable strength that the others, blinded by the superficial glare of wealth and status, had completely missed. Now, that strength was all that stood between them and the churning, gray Atlantic. "Brace for landing," Ilara's voice came over the intercom, steady as a rock, cutting through the howl of the wind. Through a sudden break in the storm clouds, the lights of Shannon Airport appeared, a welcome constellation of hope in the stormy darkness. The landing gear lowered with a heavy, groaning sound, and the plane seemed to shudder with the effort. It dipped and swayed, fighting the angry wind all the way down. In the cabin, people held hands with strangers. The rigid boundaries of class and status had dissolved, melted away by a shared mortality. All that was left were human beings, terrified and hopeful. Ilara's focus was absolute. She was a creature of pure instinct and training. She was no longer Ilara Vance, the anonymous woman who haunted libraries and lived in quiet obscurity. She was Captain Vance, call-signed Sandpiper, a pilot, an extension of the machine she commanded. This was her purpose, the one she had tried to run from. Her hands and feet moved in a seamless, fluid dance with the plane's controls, making thousands of micro-adjustments to counter the wind's assault. The runway lights rushed up to meet them, a brilliant, guiding path. With a jarring screech of tires that tore a final gasp from the passengers, the wheels of Flight 716 made contact with the solid earth of Ireland. The plane skidded sideways on the wet tarmac, its huge wings dipping precariously as Alara fought to keep it straight. She deployed the reverse thrusters, and they roared to life with a brutal, deafening force, slowing the massive aircraft with a power that pressed everyone back into their seats. It finally shuddered to a complete, final stop. For a long, suspended moment, there was absolute silence. The only sound was the ticking of the cooling engines, the drumming of the rain against the windows, and the collective, ragged sound of 200 people breathing again. Then, the cabin erupted. It started as a single sob, then a laugh, then a smattering of applause that grew into a thunderous, standing ovation. A tidal wave of relief, gratitude, and raw, unadulterated emotion washed through the plane. Audra, her face streaked with tears of relief, fumbled with the cockpit door, her hands shaking too much to work the latch properly. When she finally got it open, she saw Ilara slumped slightly in the captain's seat. "You did it," Audra whispered, her voice breaking. "You actually did it." Alara simply nodded, the immense weight of 200 lives finally lifting from her shoulders. She took off the headset, placing it gently on the console, and ran a hand through her sweat-dampened hair. When she stepped out of the cockpit, the applause intensified, then slowly, raggedly, died down as passengers got their first proper look at their savior. They stood, staring, their faces a complex, unreadable mixture of shame, gratitude, and awe. Willow, unable to contain herself, was the first to find her voice. She stood up on her seat, her young face shining with an admiration so pure it was painful to watch. "Thank you," she said, her voice clear and loud in the sudden hush. "You were amazing." Alara looked at her, across the sea of humbled faces, and offered a small, tired, genuine smile. It was a smile that acknowledged the girl's words and the simple, honest sentiment behind them. For Alara, it was more than enough. The aftermath was a blur of organized efficiency. Emergency vehicles with flashing lights surrounded the aircraft, their sirens a muted counterpoint to the drumming rain. Paramedics rushed onto the plane, carefully maneuvering a stretcher down the aisle to attend to Captain Sterling. As they passed Alara, the captain, now conscious but weak, reached out a trembling hand and grasped her arm. "Vance," he rasped, his eyes filled with the pilot's profound respect. "I knew they were wrong about you." As the passengers began to deplane, a somber, humbled procession, the consequences of their airborne trial began to find them. Preston's phone buzzed insistently. It was a text from his CEO, who had already seen a viral clip of his belligerent outburst, filmed by a quiet passenger, and uploaded the moment they got a signal. The message was curt. "We have a serious PR problem. We'll talk Monday. Bring your lawyer." Preston's face, already pale, crumbled. Genevieve, a minor celebrity whose brand was built on an image of aspirational elegance, saw her social media mentions exploding. Her cruel comments, transcribed verbatim, were being shared alongside hashtags like #Flight716, shame. Her carefully curated world was burning down in real time. Lorraine simply stared at her own reflection in the dark screen of her tablet, a woman she no longer recognized. Ilera retrieved her simple, worn bag from the overhead bin. She bypassed the fawning airline officials and the scrum of local reporters already gathering at the jet bridge. She wanted no thanks, no interviews, no accolades. Her task was done. She just wanted to disappear again into the quiet life she had built. As she stepped into the bright, chaotic terminal, a uniformed airport security officer, an older man with a military bearing and eyes that had seen their share of the world, saw her. His gaze locked onto her face, and his eyes widened in recognition. He straightened his back, brought his heels together with a sharp click, and delivered a crisp, perfect salute. "Welcome back, Captain," he said, his voice quiet but firm, a clear note of respect in the noisy terminal. "It's good to have you home." Alara paused, her gaze meeting his. It was a silent recognition between two people who understood the unwritten codes of service and sacrifice. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement, a gesture that meant more than any public praise could. Then she continued on her way. At the far end of the arrivals hall, away from the chaos, a man was waiting. He was tall and quiet, dressed in a simple dark suit that did not draw attention but spoke of a deep, unshakable confidence. He watched her approach, his expression unreadable to the crowd but as clear as a cloudless sky to her. As she reached him, Silas Vance took her hand. His grip was warm and steady. No words were needed. He had waited 7 years for her, never losing faith, never questioning, always understanding the part of her that would forever belong to the sky. As they turned to leave, a young woman in a janitor's uniform, her name tag reading Karina, stepped forward from behind her cleaning cart. She had been invisible to the frantic crowd, a ghost in the background of the drama, but she had seen everything. She clutched a damp rag in her hand, her eyes shining with an earnest light. "Ma'am," she said, her voice soft but firm, a stark contrast to the earlier jeers. "You're a hero." Alara stopped. She looked at this young woman, at her tired face and her work-worn hands, and saw a reflection of the genuine, unvarnished world she had chosen to live in. This was the recognition that mattered. She reached out and briefly touched Karina's shoulder. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was warm and sincere. Then she and Silas walked away, their hands intertwined, melting into the anonymity of the bustling airport. They left behind a cabin full of chastened souls and a world that had just been reminded of a powerful, modern truth. The measure of a person is not found in the labels they wear, the wealth they display, or the volume of their voice. It is found in their character, in the quiet courage they summon when all seems lost, in the grace they show in the face of judgment. And sometimes, the greatest heroes are the ones who never ask for a crown, the ones who walk among us, waiting for the moment they are needed, ready to command the sky and then fade, once more, back into the crowd.